Welcome to the Skills World Live radio show, sponsored by OneFile, a world where everyone is learning for their future. Stay tuned for all the news, views and interviews in association with FE News. Ladies and gentlemen, we're broadcasting today's show live from the Academy of Ideas, open for debate event from the heart of Westminster, UK. Now, will you please welcome to the stage the presenter of Skills World Live, Tom Bewick.
Hello and welcome to the Battle of Ideas Festival here at Church House in the heart of Westminster. As we record this episode of the podcast today, the atmosphere around these parts is pretty febrile. Overnight, Larry the cat has chased another fox out of Downing Street. Not this fox. Meanwhile, an anonymous Tory MP has accused the PM, Liz Truss, of having all the aptitude and charisma of a soiled nappy blowing around in a high wind. The second part of that was made up, by the way. Anyway, I shall be introducing our brilliant panel in just a few moments. But before I do that, here's a quick recap of what we'll be discussing on the Skills World Live radio show today. Productivity, or rather Britain's woeful lack of a skilled and productive workforce, is what my panel will be focusing on. Before Kwasi Kwarteng was Chancellor, he's now no longer Chancellor, he was best friends with Liz Truss, and they once wrote a book together called Britannia Unchained. It set out a vision for a Singapore-on-Thames-style country, high wages, high growth, and a low-tax economy. But in delivering this vision, Liz Truss was captured on tape, casting doubt over whether the Brits were actually up to the task, saying they had to put in a bit more graft. Going on to make the point, she said, that EU migrants have a stronger work ethic than native-born Britons. To be fair, the data backs up the general thesis that Britain does have a productivity and skills gap. The UK is currently second from bottom in the productivity league of G7 competitor nations, and just like our politics have become more like Italy, it appears our poor productivity and industrial stoppages are heading that way as well. And why does all this matter? Well, worker and employer productivity in the end is what makes all the difference between those high wages and high growth ambitions. It's the secret sauce, if you like, of how a country gets rich in the first place. Currently, the average French and American worker can produce in 4 days what it takes a typical British worker to produce in 5 days. Some pointy-head economists blame this on Britain's historic lack of workforce investment, what in the jargon is called the low skills equilibrium. The more common interpretation, which the comedian Francis Foster, you'll meet in a few moments, was telling me about off air, is that far too many British workers clock off on a Thursday afternoon, head straight for the nearest Wetherspoons, and then are not seen again until the following Tuesday. Anyway, on that unscientific revelation, join me in just a few moments when battle will commence, and we'll be introducing my super informed panel of guests.
You're listening to the Skills World Live radio show with Tom Bewick.
Now, joining the debate, we have the founder of this fine festival and democratic discourse and free speech, the noble Baroness Fox of Buckley. Claire Fox, to her friends, is the director of the Academy of Ideas and the author of I Find That Offensive, a devastating riposte to the safe spaces and cancel culture that has become such a feature of the so-called culture wars. It's also great to be joined by Dr. Michael Owens, the London-based researcher, writer and lecturer, works on urban planning and development. There's a new book coming out in a couple of weeks called Play the Game. It's an account of the development site of the 2012 London Olympics. Bringing some human resource creativity and flair to our discussion today is Rosamund Cuxton, a senior HR professional and organiser of the Birmingham Salon. She's also, I see, a singer with the band Pram.
I was.
Past tense. Talking of prams, our final panel member left his stroller along quite a few years ago now, but I'm talking about, of course, the ex-teacher, trigonometry podcast co-host and comedian Francis Foster. Francis is currently touring around the country doing his funny stand-up show, in which one routine, and I did nick this from the internet earlier, Francis, one routine, he recounts his time as a teacher in a tough South London comprehensive, told by a British Army officer returning from war-torn Afghanistan that he felt sorry for Francis, that he had such a tough job on his hands. When Francis curiously asked why, the soldier said, "Because we get to shoot the Taliban when they cause trouble, but you can't do that." Audience, will you please welcome another Skills World Live super informed panel of guests.
You're listening to the Skills World Live radio show with Tom Bewick.
Okay, the way this is going to work is you each have 2 minutes on this central question on should Brits be working harder or smarter. And Claire, we're going to come to you first.
I do think that the recent lockdown phenomena of furloughing workers and now people saying that they want to work from home is problematic, more culturally than what it says for productivity. But I think that there is something positive about leaving the house and going into a workplace, even if the workplace that you're going into is pretty grim, because it makes you and forces you become a public person, a social person. So there's that side to it. But I think this idea that, workers aren't grafting hard enough misunderstands the nature of what causes a productivity crisis, because for me, one of the things that's lacking from all of the discussion about growth is nobody's investing in growth. And so the tendency is to not think about new innovations, technological changes, really turbocharging a new kind of industrial revolutions, creating new jobs. It's always the same old tired jobs and workers being accused of not working hard enough at them. So that's the sort of thing I'd like to explore in the rest of the discussion, actually.
Thanks for that, Claire. We're going to go over to you, Rosamond. Sit next to her.
Yeah, so I think reading the comment by Liz Truss was somewhat galling. This is the same government that did encourage everybody to go and work from home. Saw something about 400,000 people have left the workforce in recent months.
Mainly over 50, right?
Yes, because of ill health. So that to me is linked also to the measures that were taken by the government for the pandemic, and now the backlog in the NHS. But on the positive side, I've been also reading that it's the younger generation, the early careers employees who are leading the return to the workplace. I think that's heartening. I think that speaks to a kind of common sense about where it's good to start your career, which is in the presence of your co-workers. And it's a common sense that they're showing. I think there's a lot of cynicism about working in an office environment. There's some management disorientation about the value of work and the workplace. I think the cynicism is understandable in that it's based on other things which I'm sure we'll get to talk about, which are related to infrastructure and commute times and childcare provision and things like that.
Okay, well, I definitely want to come on to the whole issue of the redesign of work or the design of employment and skills and all of that in the second part of the podcast. But Mike, and you work in urban regeneration and planning, so in a way you sort of really see the spatial aspects of this and what, of course, more popularly been called more recently levelling up and the impact that has had or not had. But over to you for your 2-minute opening gambit.
Yeah, I would agree with the starting point that it's a really good idea to work hard. So I think that the idea that somehow our lives would be better if we were all more leisurely misses what we can get out of working. But I suppose that that kind of leads you to the question: well, why would you work hard? And for me, and it's something that I want to sort of explore in our conversation today. You work hard if there's a purpose to what you're doing, and I suppose my challenge to Liz Truss would be, well, you really need to lead from the front, and so in terms of the kind of kickstarting the economy and then organising a skills strategy behind an economy you really need to be purposive from the front end, and I think that that's kind of missing from the equation at the moment. Lots of opportunities to tinker around with policies or to sort of get technical on these questions, but we really need, I would suggest, to have the confidence that we are, that as a country, we're really purposive about the productive economy, about, in my case, growth and housing development more generally, and I think if we had a strategy at that kind of level, then you could start to see where skills fit in, and then also where we as individuals fit into that wider story.
Okay. I'm sure we'll jump into some of the more technical aspects of this at some point in the podcast, but I just want to keep this part firmly focused on the politics, because in the end, this debate in many ways has been kicked off, hasn't it, from really the mini budget onwards. Now the mini budget that we think may no longer be the budget that was announced, because Kwasi Kwarteng isn't the Chancellor anymore, and we have a new Chancellor in Jeremy Hunt. So why are politicians even talking about this in the way they are? And do you think part of the problem, I mean, Michael, you sort of referenced this about we shouldn't be shy about the fact that work is good. There's a dignity that comes with work. Often people don't have to be defined by their work, of course not, but there's certainly a lot that comes from that, and it's more than just a pay packet and paying the bills. But when you look back 3 or 4 decades, I don't want to look back through rose-tinted glasses, politicians used to bang on about productivity all the time. I mean, they used to have the productivity figures, the latest ones, balance of payment figures were on the news. I mean, maybe we need a different language, I don't know, Claire, but why are politicians almost sort of shy about talking about this issue of productivity and how important it is to paying the country's bills and your own bills in the end? Well,
because I don't think that they're interested in productivity. I mean, that's the problem. I don't think that there's a real understanding of the importance of productivity. And if you actually look around the debate on the mini budget, the inference was that all that had to happen was you cut taxes, you let the capitalist class and wealthy people have more money, and then they would invest in making jobs happen. Well, that's why is that a follow-on? There's actually been a lot of cheap money floating around for a long time, and they've actually financialised that. Often they've given their shareholders more money, or they've basically acquired other businesses or what have you, but they haven't invested in new technology. Why? Because it requires risk-taking. They haven't invested in their workers because it's a long-term strategy where you have to say, we'll do skills and so on and so forth. And so I think that productivity is almost like they think, make workers work harder, right? And another way of doing it is bring in lots of immigrants, because they will give a productivity increase. Now, this is not a comment on what I think about immigration, but their attitude is, oh, well, we'll get all these kind of young, fit, healthy people from other countries desperate to work hard, and that will be all right. And that's why they end up saying British workers are sort of a bit slovenly, because they're not as inspired by working in Amazon, doing some of the jobs. And we just one caveat, which is I made the mistake myself of talking about work as though it could be done from home. We know that millions of people during the lockdown could not work from home because they were frontline workers, and that actually the economy would collapse. But we still don't recognise that frontline workers who, come and pick your bins up, work in some of the major infrastructure projects, they're still not treated. They're still treated as the worst in society, even though we said we were going to remember. We haven't.
No, and not everybody lives in a 4-bedroom house in Surrey with super fast broadband and a nice garden either, which, not saying that all civil servants who work in Whitehall have that, but certainly some of the more senior ones probably do. Francis, your 2 minutes then. Where are we with the politics of all this?
I think a lot of it comes back to the lockdown. There's a very famous and brilliant comedian called Reginald D. Hunter, and he said, during lockdown, we were all sent back to our rooms to think about what we've done. And it's a great joke because, like all great jokes, it works on many different levels. And I think a lot of people were on the treadmill of life. They were going to work, they were coming back, they were going to work, they were coming back, many of them based in London. Many of them had no chance of getting on the housing market, a lot of their money going on rent and transport, stagnating wages. We have a property market that successive governments, right the way from Labour, right the way through to Conservatives, a housing crisis who have done absolutely nothing to solve. And I think a lot of people just went back to their rooms, thought about their lives, looked around and gone, quite simply, why? Why am I grafting? Why am I putting in this effort when the reality is what am I going to get from my efforts? And one of my things that I get really frustrated with conservatives about is when they bemoan young people being woke. And I think to myself, well, of course they're woke. Do you expect them to be conservative when they've got nothing to conserve? So I think having Liz Truss pointing the finger and saying workers don't work hard enough, and my response to her would be, well, what are they going to get for their work? What are they going to get for their hours? What are they going to get? Are they really going to be able to improve their lives massively when property is unattainable and wages have stagnated?
Yeah, exactly. Well, the Economist's answer to that question in terms of what are people getting for their work, the reality is since the 2008 financial crash, wages are stagnating. On average, people's wages have grown by less than 1%. It's actually 0.7% a year. All that feeds through in the end, doesn't it, to this notion of whether or not we live in a prosperous society or not. And clearly people are feeling, for a whole bunch of reasons, not least the energy cost crisis, that that basic social contract, if you like, that perhaps existed at the time when we were growing up, that the next generation would be, often your own offspring, would be better than the previous generation. That social contract, particularly with Gen Z and Gen A, seems to have gone out the window. I'm going to come out for questions with the audience in just a few moments, so do get those questions ready. But Rosamund, I just want to come to you finally then, sort of on the politics of some of this. I mean, if you were advising Keir Starmer about this going into the next general election, what would you be saying to him as the leader of the opposition to try and capitalise on some of this debate?
Well,
would you be saying anything to him? You don't have to. I mean, it's a free country.
We do need to consider why the productivity issue has been around for so long. I mean, it predates the 2008 financial crash. It predates Brexit. I know Brexit has been blamed for it as well. It predates the pandemic. There is a lack of productive investment going on. I think that the writer on the economy, Phil Mullen, always gives this really good example of where we've gone in terms of technology, which is the car wash, which used to be a big machine you'd find in a garage which would do the car washing job for you, and has been replaced by a gang of guys with sponges and buckets.
What Jack Straw called squeegee merchants all those years ago.
The squeegee merchants example, yes, yeah.
See them every Saturday in my local area in the car.
Exactly. So, but I think that's replicated across the economy, and there has to be a way of incentivising businesses or to invest in new technology, and there also has to be a cultural shift. It really is a problem, because I think, I agree with Francis about having something to work for, but if you think about it, in the past, people with a lot worse prospects had a work ethic that I think has been...
In your view, though, is that work ethic less than previously?
I think it's not modelled by management and leadership.
OK, well, we'll come on to that whole sort of job design. But audience, do start putting your hands up so I know who I can come out to. I won't be able to come out to you all at once, so forgive me, but I'll certainly be picking up some questions in just a couple of moments. Just sort of final kind of reflections then on all of that. I mean, because actually the car washing example is just a classic, isn't it? Because when I looked into the figures as to why, for example, the UK is 20% less productive in the G7 compared to France, one of the reasons that's put down to that is because in some ways the higher wage costs that French employers face, and also actually incidentally a higher burden of regulation, one of those regulations being you can't set up one of those squeegee merchant car washing places in France. It's not allowed, right? So in our deregulated labour market, it is allowed. It's not allowed in France. What has it resulted in when you go over there? It's these automat car washes. So you go along, it's all automated, you have to do it yourself rather than just sit on the side and let some East Europeans do it for you, right? So you're absolutely right. There's something there, isn't there, about our culture, the culture of the labour market that is driving a lot of this poor productivity. Claire, I know you're burning to come in. You will do, because the audience will spark some further thoughts in your mind. So I'm going to come to this gentleman here. Just say briefly who you are, but can I ask you for very brief contributions? One of my favourite speeches in the world ever is the Gettysburg Address. It was 43 words. It was amazing. So if you can be Abraham Lincoln today, that would be great. Thank you.
I'll try. Yeah, my name's Andrew. I work in both higher education and executive education, coaching and training. And there's a layer I want to add to this, just as a thought, and that is it's not about how hard we work, but it's whether we can deal with discomfort. Because where skill is about discomfort. Learning is about discomfort. What I've noticed in both university and in business, it's not about how hard people work. People want to be happy all the time. And that has been a thing in the last, I think last 15 years. People like Professor Seligman talk about this obsession about happiness. Work, now any kind of work, even Richard Branson, I've seen Richard Branson, he has bad days. He said it to us. He said, I have bad days at the office, but I go into the office the next day. That's Richard Branson. And so I think part of the issue that we have is discomfort. Can you deal with discomfort in work, not just how hard you work?
Okay. Coming over to this gentleman here with glasses on.
Yeah, my name's David. I work in the professional services sector, actually, which is one that is in many ways symbolic of people often working in very, very long hours, loving to work very, very hard, trying to drive productivity gains for others. And I would argue perhaps if they worked a little less hard, it might be better for the economy. The growth of things like professional services is often symbolic of a society which is not very productive. So it's seeking out marginal gains wherever it can do in a desperate bid to try and sort of squeeze out a little bit of value. Sometimes people might say counterproductively, because actually we know the growth of compliance, the growth of these kind of sort of measures to try and improve productivity get in the way. So I think we kind of do have to have a kind of a bit of a kind of question with ourselves about what kind of productive jobs we're going to be doing. And actually, if we want to move towards a more productive society, how comfortable are we with actually people having to work less hard because they may be losing their job and have to be applied elsewhere? And how much pain are we willing to tolerate?
Indeed, excellent point, which is why in the Scandinavian countries they have the job rotation schemes where people increasingly share work. Eddie, could you come to the front row now, please? And I'd like to get this woman in, please. And then I'm going to wrap up just for that segment. Others who are trying to get in, I will come out to you block by block. So please go ahead.
Other side of that equation is, to what extent do people think that conflict in work is actually a positive thing around? I was struck by a comment somebody made in an Institute of Ideas online discussion a couple of months ago, where they made the point that the decline of unionisation, ironically, is stopping some of the conflict within work that's allowing a greater tussle over what should and shouldn't be done in the workplace. And I thought that was quite an interesting way to think about unions that I'd not thought about before.
What, you're suggesting that unions, where you have collective bargaining, actually can cause more conflict than
that the conflict, not so much collective bargaining, but the presence of people pushing back, itself creates grit in the ointment, that itself creates a productive, creative element of work. I don't know, haven't thought it through, but I thought it was quite an interesting observation.
No, fascinating. Thank you. Thanks for that, audience. Panel, 3 really insightful points there. One's really about the nature, perhaps really, of modern management and work and employees and subordinates. Have we got to a point, frankly, where the notion of well-being has so overtaken the workplace and HR practices that people necessarily don't have the work ethic because they're just not encouraged to develop it? We've got sort of capitalist culture that, in a way, it's as it always has been, it's about profit maximisation, but there almost seems to be a decoupling going on between maximising profits and then also being good to workers and ensuring that they've got a decent pay packet to keep a roof over their heads, feed their families if they've got them. It's the sort of Deliveroo driver. It's the it's the Uber app. Francis, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, so I thought it was a very, very interesting point the gentleman made over there when he was talking about happiness. And to me, I wouldn't see it as being about happiness. I would say that a problem that we have, particularly in education, when I used to work with secondary students and primary students, is resilience. The number of times that you'd be teaching a lesson and a kid would get something wrong, and you would just see their head go down, and a lot of the times they would just give up. They would give up, and they would find something too challenging, and they wouldn't want to carry on. And I think that's a real problem in society, because like that gentleman said, to learn a skill is difficult. To learn a skill is painful. And to learn a skill, particularly at the start of learning a skill, is humiliating because you're not very good at it. But if you don't have the resilience, if you don't have the strength of character to push past that, then you're never going to acquire the skills, which means that you're never going to gain mastery of them, which is necessary when you enter the workplace, and they're very necessary to improve.
Gaining mastery of skills, Claire, apprenticeships, I mean, where's all that gone?
Well, I think that first of all, I think that the apprenticeship system was based on a notion of a master pupil model that's actually not very fashionable these days. That's the one thing. The other thing is that the apprenticeship system was based on teaching very often highly skilled techniques to a new generation, and we haven't got enough new highly skilled jobs. I mean, the reason why, a lot of the apprenticeship schemes that are on offer are actually not very good, because actually what they're doing is they're introducing people to jobs that are actually semi-skilled or not skilled at all jobs. So that really drives me mad. Whereas in other words, I think that first of all, I think we need more apprenticeship schemes at all sorts of levels. I think they need to be funded not just by the government but by the companies as well. There needs to be that notion of passing on ways of doing things. But we also need to have new jobs coming online. So my example in terms of the car wash is picking crops and farming and agriculture. It seems to me that what we need is a huge investment in modernising agriculture, and that picking crops by hands or picking fruit by hands is actually unnecessary in 2022 because you've got machines to do it. When you actually say to people in the agricultural industry, why don't you do that? They say, well, because it would cost a lot of money to do that. In other words, people won't invest in the technological change that is needed. They then think, well, it's easier and cheaper to have a load of cheap labour. Hence, we've had a lot of immigration on the basis of not that we're a nice, happy, come and live in this country, but just you're cheap and exploitable because you're from countries where you get paid rubbish here, but it'll still be better than where you were. But the other thing about it is that it doesn't mean just because you've got the technology that you're going to sack loads of people, because what it does is it frees up people from doing mundane drudgery jobs to do more interesting jobs like servicing the machinery that works on agriculture, or to find new industries as we go. And that's what they're not doing. So this is partly the thing is, in order for work to have a productive quality to it, you also need to feel that you're in a dynamic economy that's creating new industries, new jobs, new opportunities for people. And that's just not happening.
Yeah, well, we'll unpick that so-called dynamic economy after this short break.
You're listening to the Skills World Live radio show with Tom Bewick.
OneFile is the best apprenticeship e-portfolio in the world. But did you know it's ideal for all kinds of vocational training, including traineeships? OneFile is very flexible, so it has everything you need to deliver, manage and track traineeship progress.
We're currently using OneFile for all our traineeship learners. They love it, and so do we. It's fabulous. Thank you, OneFile.
To find out more about OneFile, head to onefile.co.uk and book a demo with a member of the team.
Welcome back to Skills World Live. In this second part, we're going to delve a bit deeper into what's gone wrong in Britain's labour market. Employers are investing nearly a quarter less in workforce training than they were in 2005, according to the Labour Force survey. Meanwhile, the Home Office issued more than 1 million skilled visas to overseas migrants last year. Claire, you mentioned this briefly in your opening comments. I mean, Britain does have an economic model, doesn't it, that has become arguably over-reliant on importing labour into the country.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very enthusiastic about people coming to this country in terms of immigration. I'm probably a lot more liberal about immigration than a lot of my fellow, for example, Brexit voters. But what I want is us to think about it, and you have to have control over it, and you have to think through. And my objection is when immigrant labour is treated as cheap labour that undercuts domestic labour. I think that that's a way out of avoiding for example, doing more work on improving apprenticeships or the skills gap and so on and so forth. That's very important. But of course, I've got no objection to, and in fact it's part of, as it were, the country's rich tapestry, that just as happened in the past, that you'll say, well, you know, we do actually need a lot of people to come over and work as doctors, and if there are people who are doctors in other countries who'd like to come here, good, but it might well be, are there people who are prepared to get skilled up? Now, this is the bit that I'm not sure about. I'm genuinely not sure about. There are opportunities for people who are not working at the moment to gain new skills in this country that aren't taken. And so there is a problem, which is if people say, and this might be the point that was made about well-being, if people say, and I've heard this amongst young people, what I know in my family, who say, there's no way I'm working in the hospitality industry because it means getting up at sort of 6 o'clock, 6:30. And obviously I do feel old and crotchety and go, well, get up at 6:30 then and go to work. Anyway, do you see what I mean? And they're like, why would I bother doing that then? Now, I know that's a caricature, but if I give any credit to Liz Truss, and it's very reluctantly that I say this, there's a cultural issue here. Something's gone wrong that people won't think that they should go out and work hard and then progress through a career rather than just expecting to get well paid. And
yeah, but do you not agree it's a cultural issue at both ends of the labour market, supply and demand? We talked earlier about potentially work ethic and how that's changed interculturally over many decades, but there's also the culture of employers. I mean, just talking about that hospitality example, you know, I read an article the other day of a pub owner, hospitality owner, who was lamenting the fact that for every home office visa she has to fill out the application form to bring somebody over, it costs her £2,000. And I was just sitting there scratching my head and said, well, you know, I'm really sorry obviously about your skill shortage or your skills gap, but we do have in this country still 700,000 young people under the age of 25 who are not in education, employment and work. Fair enough. Some of them very complex reasons as to why they're detached from the labour market. So you can't simply do the math and say there's 700,000 people that can do the work. But I'm sure there are quite a lot of young people that are missing out on opportunities, especially when you see over the last 5 years there's been a 44% reduction in the number of apprenticeships for young people. So Rosamund, just help me out with this. I mean, because you work in as a senior HR sort of professional, what's the cultural thing in large parts of British industry? It's almost like it's automatic. The default is go to foreign labour as opposed to how do I work with my local training providers? How do I work with schools, education? What's the role of the local authority? The strategic planning piece, Michael, you were mentioning, coming in and helping to create these opportunities for local people.
That's a really good question. I mean, one of the things I was going to say is that as well as the number of people who've come into Britain and to work, we also have lots of people working for British companies overseas. So there's a default position also to offshore a large part of your labour force to other countries, rather than, as you say, to go through putting them through training, bringing them in to the workforce. I think it's complex. I think part of it is it's almost, as you say, it's like a default move. This is what we'll do. The wages over there are lower. We'll just get these people. They've been trained by the systems over there. You know, they've got good levels of education. If you go to India to employ an IT professional, you're going to get people who can speak English to a pretty good standard. It's a shift that has to take place in terms of how we think longer term. It's a
long-term strategy. Yeah, absolutely. Francis, I know from watching your podcast you're a big fan of America. You're a big fan of the American dream, the work ethic, the fact it's a lot easier, arguably, over there to set up a business. But interestingly, you know, their HB1 visa system, I get too technical, only because I've had to have one in the past when I've worked in the States.
I'm glad you picked my expert topic.
Well, no, I mean, I just want to sort of get a sort of cultural commentator's view on this one, because one of the things that the US Department of Labour insists on when issuing those visas to employers to bring in overseas workers, and I've been one of those in the past, is that for every foreign overseas worker you bring in, they use the money, they ring fence the HB1 visa money, and it gets spent on the American Registered Apprenticeship Programme. In other words, there's a view that, fine, employers have got to bring in short term, often labour to fill particular gaps in the labour market, but there's a sort of social premium on that, and the social premium is that money will be reinvested back in apprenticeships. I mean, do you think Liz Truss is missing a trick here? I don't know how long she's going to be Prime Minister for. By the time this podcast goes out, she might not be. I don't know. But, do you think there's just some disjoint here going on with the policy makers?
I think part of it is that everybody wants a simple solution to a complex problem. And by using cheap imported labour, you have a very simple solution. And what that means is it's also a short-term solution, because due to the nature of democracy, you don't have politicians aren't in power for that long. So actually, they're not motivated to provide long-term solutions that are going to become in 20 years' time or 25 years' time, because they're not going to be in power anymore. So by picking a short-term solution, you get a sudden boost or surge to the economy. That means that they can then say that, look, how we've improved the economy over the last 1 or 2 years, which means they get re-elected. They do their 2 terms, they leave, they then go and talk on, and then they get a variety of perks when they leave government. So I think the problem is that nobody's actually that interested in the long term. What people are interested in is the here and now. And if you think what happened with the Brexit referendum is what this country did is, in a way, it's actually quite vampiric in that we took a lot of the skills from the poorer parts of Europe. So there was a brain drain from poorer countries in Europe coming and working here. And you can't blame these people. I would do exactly the same in their position. But you're not helping the people here. You're not skilling them. You're not investing in them. And what that means is that you have cities like London, and again, when you walk around London, you just feel that it's disconnected from the rest of the country, that it's not part of the country. It's a different thing entirely. And I think that's a real problem, because people then feel a disconnection, people then feel frustrated, people feel angry, and that leads to, populist movements and all the rest of it. So what I really think is important is that we have politicians and people who are actually interested in the long-term future in this country and not having a short-term solution.
Okay. Audience, get your questions ready. I'm going to be coming to this side of the room next. But Michael, coming to you, I'm going to plug your book. It's coming out, I think, on the 28th of October, The Playing Game, which is all about the development sort of aspects of the 2012 Olympics. I don't know anything about that. I'll have to read your book to find out about that. But what I do remember very vaguely about the Danny Boyle opening ceremony, the massive bed for the NHS and some of these other great iconic British symbols, was actually, it told the story, though, of the positive contribution that immigration has made to this country over many, many decades. And do you not think that sometimes in our political discourse, that side of the argument does get lost? Because, as I think France is saying about some of the short-term politics around this, it's often about immigration, not integration. It's often about the headline numbers, not the quality of the immigrants that are coming in. I mean, from a kind of regeneration and planning point of view, how can we deal with some of those challenges as well?
I mean, I think two things I'd pick out from what's been said. One is that there's an act of blind faith to suggest that if you simply cut off immigration from overseas, then spontaneously there will be a renaissance in British people taking jobs that were formerly done by immigrants, and on the other side of that, this is the idea that there's a simple solution to what's actually a complex problem. I could be as crass as the government has been, by saying that that if you had a dynamic, growing economy, then it would be possible both to accommodate immigration at scale into the country and also to create jobs and opportunities for local people. But I think that kind of misses the challenge in a way. That would be as glib as the government has been, and I would say, the kinds of problems that are worth focusing on. One is, well, what are we good at? You know, that's one kind of question I think is a real challenge for us. And we know that over the past 30 years, the answer has been, well, we're pretty good at services and we're very good at knowledge-rich services. We're good, you know, the professional services that one of our audience members made reference to earlier. Or, you know, we're particularly good at managing international finance and, you know, and doing all of the specialist jobs that you need to manage global flows of capital. I think that, you know, specifically we have, because those bits of the economy have been dynamic, we've missed what it takes to take advantage of what you can do in a knowledgeable, sophisticated nation like ours to grow industry in particular and to grow the productive economy more generally. And so to kind of tie that to the Olympics, you know, I would say that the Olympics in microcosm shows you what it can look like if the state intervenes and you set off on a long-term project which has an imperative that you have a relationship between the state and the private sector. Do you know, the construction jobs, the kind of creation of a, you know, of the kind of follow-on bits of the economy, you know, in the land around the Olympics. And then I think when you start to think like that, you get into, well, what, you know, these kind of complex questions, what kinds of relationships, you know, between the people, between the higher education players that might move in.
Well, that's in the final segment, Michael. You know, we will come on to that. What should be the response of education? I'm going to go out to the audience in just a few seconds. Just wrap up this point.
Then, I suppose what I'm saying is that one of the solutions, not all of them, but one of the solutions is that if you focus on a place, then that enables you to put together some of the relationships that are implied by these kind of complex solutions that we're making reference.
Yeah. Okay. Big push there for the strategic state. Let's go out to the audience.
Yeah, my idea is, why can't we do this at school level? You know, when most kids are being naughty, why can't we bring it back in education level? They're not academic kids. They're going to just get kicked out of school and then they're on the streets. We have a duty of care to educate them at least till they're 16. Put them in apprenticeships, like you said, area by area. If it's rural, then it needs to be farming, seaside, fishing maybe. The centre of London, we need trades. You know, we're really short on trades. They could be doing that from 14. Why not?
Although we're out the common fisheries policy, we're not kind of completely out of it, are we? So quite how many of our coastal areas can go out and do fishing.
About the area,
yes,
if you want to make it for an area by area, then it could be rural, it
Absolutely.
could be seaside,
we need to utilise
and it could be town,
all the talent we've got.
Yeah.
Okay, moving on. Would you want to come to the side? So let's go in the front row here. This lady here and then the lady behind and all.
Hello there. So I was formerly in the civil service and actually broke away to become an educational entrepreneur. And to some extent, I think that we can address the problem. Do we need Brits to work harder or smarter? I think they need to do both. I have established a social mobility charity, which actually I feel does this to a very large extent. So we work with disadvantaged children. We have 150 on our books. We've existed for the past 5 years. And what we work on is not just competence, which is what schools do. They're so focused on getting the students to work hard to exams, but all the rest of the skills that matter in life, critical thinking, problem solving, emotional intelligence to become the next generation of leaders, is missing. They are not examined. So what we do on our mentoring program is, yes, we do the academic stuff, the creative application of that, you know, to be able to exist in the workplace, but we also work on traits and behaviours for success. And I think we should do more of that.
So I have a comment on, like, I guess the long-term future of work, and I can only really talk to office jobs because that's what I have experience with. So I was quite a late child, so there is a big age gap between myself and my mother. She only ever worked in a country in Eastern Europe, whilst I started my career in the UK. I think she was a very ambitious woman, and she had a
a senior job. I don't think I'm any more successful than she is. Yet whenever she sees me working, she thinks I work too hard, I work too long hours. And I'm wondering whether this current culture of work, is this normal? Is this sustainable? And if I have kids in the future, should I expect that they are going to have to work even harder than I do? And if that's the case, then I may either encourage them to have a different type of job or encourage them to go back to another country where they don't have to work this hard, because it's not all about the money.
Not all about working harder, but working smarter. Right, that's all we've got time for in this section, but let's find out now what the One File tune of the week is.
You're listening to the Skills World live radio show. Great music from the 80s, 90s and 2000s. Time now for the One File tune of the week.
You were just listening there to that late icon of British culture and pop, David Bowie, Let's Dance. And we're back here live at the Battle of Ideas Festival in London, organised by the Academy of Ideas. Right, okay, back to today's discussion. Just heard there from the questions about the education system, about still, is it working harder, working smarter? Ex-teacher Francis, I'm going to come to you. What does the education system need to start doing to respond to some of these challenges we heard from our audience there?
I thought all 3 points were very good. I will address the 2 points in particular from the ladies talking about education, both of which I thought were excellent. We don't do enough to work with kids who are not academic. It really is that simple. When I was working in secondary education, these kids were sort of pushed to the side. The schools weren't interested in them because as long as they got a C, then that was fine. And then what they did afterwards was just what they did. The reality is primary schools are like this now. Schools, secondary schools and primary schools have now become factories to harvest data. They become factories to harvest data to prove that the government is doing a, inverted commas, good job. And I'll give you an example. So I was a Year 6 teacher for many years. Year 6 is the final year of primary school. I had to teach kids how to pass a grammar exam. This grammar exam did not teach kids how to write better. It did not teach kids to be more expressive. It didn't actually teach kids to understand grammar. The whole point of the grammar exam was for basically me to bombard kids with pointless information so they could pass this test, and in a couple of weeks they would forget everything about the test. But it wouldn't matter, because as long as they pass the grammar exam, that would mean the school could get whatever it was, like an 82% pass rate, and the government would go, well, in the London Borough of Newham, there's a 78 pass rate on the grammar test. But what does that actually mean? The reality is it means nothing, because the kids, because of this test, it doesn't teach the kids to write better. It doesn't teach themselves to express themselves better. It doesn't teach them anything in any way. All that it does is just a way to harvest data to make the government look like they're doing a good job.
What's your view on that, Rosamond?
Well, I'm not quite as cynical, I don't think, sorry.
It'd be difficult if you were.
I think that... So I agree that I think the less academic children could be, leaving school earlier, as in 16, and going into work. But not just for this. I suppose I worry that what would happen is that they would become the new supply to replace some of the unskilled workers from abroad. So there'd be a sort of cynical replacement of them in the workforce. The education system has to focus on a very good education, and the audience have raised the point about discomfort, dealing with discomfort, dealing with conflict. I think that the education system also needs to help prepare children for those things in the workplace as well. So critical thinking, as in exploring ideas, not having a sense that the school is going to just inculcate you into things, but it is actually giving you a broad education. If schools and universities had this sense of purpose in what they were doing, I think that would also help, because what we've talked about in the culture of the workplace is not just missing from the workplace, it's also missing from these other institutions.
Absolutely. So state education in this country, as it happens, we're just across the road from the Department for Education. It was founded in, well, it was the Board of Education in 1870, and that's really when the state got properly into education. Still, the school leaving age was 12, 13 at the time. But Claire, do you think, 150 years on, we still haven't really reconciled this tension, have we, in our sort of foundation learning system? It was developed during the first industrial revolution. Arguably the means of production at the time, you'll appreciate this as an old Marxist, right, was about product, mass production, moving things along a timeline. That's why we have, for example, arguably kids all start at the same age at the same time. They're batches moving through the system, as the late Ken Robinson once said, a great educationalist. But here we are now in the 21st century, and that economic model, talk about productivity, that whole production model has gone. There are aspects of it still around. Capitalism hasn't gone yet, probably much to your... But the point is, we haven't necessarily updated the curriculum, the system of education to cope with what now is often called Gen Z learning and the metaverse. The fact that actually these skills that we've heard from the audience, creativity, problem-solving skills, you do hear that language around the national curriculum. We shouldn't say that all teachers aren't aware of these things. I mean, France, I'm sure you'd agree, you've been in the schooling system, you are aware of these things. But it's the system that arguably puts more of a premium on, first of all, rote learning, rather than learning for the love of learning or the discovery of learning or human flourishing, whatever you want to call it. And also the other tension in policy terms around education, let's be honest, and skills, is accountability. Because why a lot of parents say, don't abolish Ofsted, is because they rather like the fact when they go and move into an area and they've got a few quid to spend from the house they sold last time to get a bigger one, to move into an area with an outstanding school, because Ofsted tells them it's an outstanding school. So we've got this tension, haven't we, I think, between the sort of the curriculum, what people learn, how teachers teach, and then we've got this huge, massive challenge around accountability in the system. Because if we swept it all away like Finland has, no Ofsted there, how can you ensure still that the profession of education doesn't take us back to where we were in the 70s? And you'll know the debates around education was the secret garden. The fact that it was only the teachers that knew what was going on in schools, the parents were nowhere to be seen.
You see, I'm rather hard line on this, which is I'm hard line because I think that the role of schools is straightforwardly to inculcate new generations with the best that's known and thought to date. And that hasn't changed. You can say, well, you've got to make it relevant and modern for the modern age. And you think there's thousands of years' worth of things we have to pass on. And I don't want to keep adding to it. Now, of course, when it comes to science and technology, that will change. I mean, I appreciate that. But I would say that until you're 16, you deserve an academic education. But that doesn't mean that you should be any good at it, because a perfectly reasonable point was made. You know, a lot of kids aren't academic and they don't want to do it. But I don't care whether they want to do it. They are entitled to it. You know, a child will say, what's the point of doing Shakespeare, miss? I tell them an English teacher, you know what I mean? Or I was, rather. And I'd say, I know it's boring and I know it's not going to be useful at work, but it's your heritage. You've got to have access to this. So my attitude is, plumbers, they might end up working as, but all plumbers should be introduced to philosophy, Shakespeare and all the rest of it. Where the crisis is, it seems to me, is that post-16, we've lost any respect whatsoever for skills and training, right? For training. So schools do that bit, and then we have to have proper training going on, invested in training. And that's where...
But you don't think, though, sorry to challenge on this, do you not think there's a bit of cause and effect here? Because it feels to me, and push back on me, this isn't the case, you're kind of really taking the Michael Gove line on this. Which,
I don't agree with Michael Gove on
and the Nick Gibb
apart from
line,
this.
which is, it is about the traditional education. And look, as somebody that failed all his O levels, you can tell how old I am now in the audience, but the one I did get was English, so I think you'll be pleased about that. And of course, I agree with you that to discover Shakespeare, to discover Chaucer, to discover these great works of art and our heritage, it's important that every single child, regardless of their own background, socioeconomic status, has that. But you've also got, as I often describe, because I go out and speak to a lot of education audiences, and it's why I came into education much later, was I often say that the process of schooling killed off my desire to learn. Education transformed my life. What is it about schooling that is not preparing young people?
Schooling is the place that we have done. Well, first of all, I think that most schools at the moment are not doing what I've just said, despite what I've just said. What I'm trying to say is that schools aren't a factory to create factory workers, right? They are not about getting you a job, and they are not about skilling you for work. Where we are letting the young down is that we're telling them that the only way that you can get a job is to go on an academic ladder that gets to university, and that then you get a degree and then you might get a job. And we're also completely, and this is a political culture, which is we're completely demeaning of anyone who's not academic and hasn't got a degree or hasn't got any academic qualifications. But the obligation of adults is to allow young people to the age of 16 access to the best that's known and thought. And my concern is that we're going to end up in a situation when we say, a lot of these working class kids aren't interested in Shakespeare, so why don't they go off and do a bit of training and skills when they're 12? And the boring, irrelevant bits, like teaching them classical music or teaching over there, that's for those people who don't really need to, who are no good at skills. And we know what that's like. We know where that leads, right?
So, Francis, I know it's been a while since you've been in mainstream education, but actually, in many ways, the policymakers are agreeing with Claire. They're saying, hence the Michael Govian reforms we had in England, other types of reforms have happened, of course, elsewhere in the United Kingdom, where education's devolved. But essentially, it has been this notion of focus on the STEM subjects, English, maths. Hasn't stopped, by the way. 46% on average of young people at the age of 16 don't get their English and maths. That becomes then a huge challenge for the further education college system. And then this new policy now that's coming in called T-levels. I don't know Anybody heard of T-levels in the room? Yep. Quite a few people got their hands up. Well, that's good to hear. If you're listening over at the Department for Education and the Marketing Department, you've not done too bad a job on that one. But the point is that actually, that idea ground young people in this country in the basics, English, maths, the science subjects, in a sense, privilege academic education over other forms of vocational technical education. Oh, but by the way, at 16, choose whether you're going down that academic route, A-levels, the traditional A-level route now, or you have to choose to go into this T-level route, a technical route. In other words, I look at that as an educationalist and think, hold on a minute, are working class people potentially being sold out here? And what I mean by that, so what I'm actually, Claire, agreeing with you, is you're cutting off then the opportunity for somebody at 16 who may or may not want to go into an occupation or a technical vocational area, because you're saying they've got to choose, which was the 1944 education. I want to hear from Francis on that, and then we'll come back to you, Claire. Sorry.
Okay. Sorry,
I've gone on too long.
I think the problem is with any path that you choose or any decision that you make, there are always going to be trade-offs. They just are. And we just have to accept that. That is always going to be the case. Having taught in schools where there's a lot of kids who really struggle with the academics, the problem that I always had with this is I saw a lot of these kids struggle with the academic side of it, and you were just setting them up for failure day in, day out. And you saw these kids becoming demoralised. You saw these kids' self-worth going through the floor because every day you would set them up with a task that they wouldn't be able to meet for a variety of different reasons, right? And I just think there needs to be a more effective way. And I agree with you. I think we should teach all kids Shakespeare. I think we should teach them about our country.
What about Philip Larkin?
Yeah, exactly. I'm not allowed to swear, am I? Right, okay.
We can always bleep it out for us.
Yeah, okay. But also, what we need to accept is that different people have different skills. And by having a system where more kids are allowed to showcase their skills and find the skills that they have, and these skills are celebrated, I think will make for better, happier, and more functional kids.
Yeah. Michael, I'm going to come back to you, Claire, I promise. Michael, think about your regeneration hat on. I mean, around some of these big projects, formerly the Olympics, we've got Hinckley C and Hinckley B now in one part of the country. There's HS2 going to be roaring through the country at great taxpayer expense. I mean, aren't there 13 and 14-year-olds, frankly, who don't want to be in a classroom all week? If they had a combination of this idea that there was a quality apprenticeship and training, some proper work experience, and still getting the Shakespeare or the Larkin, I mean, surely that's the happy medium in this debate, isn't it? Not the kind of potentially, and Claire's going to push back on me on this, I know, educational monoculture, because that's what I feel has happened in this country. There's an educational monoculture that says there's only one form of success, and that's academic success, and that's what's had the whole expansion of Blair's target and all the rest of it. But what do you say about this notion of 14, 15-year-olds need to get involved far earlier to deal with Francis' point that they're just bored stiff sitting in the classroom?
Well, I mean, I'm going to go on and eulogise about skills training linked to work. But before we say that, we've got a huge battle on our hands to win the political argument to have a country that's worth living in and to have a kind of productive economy and all the rest of it. And sadly for all of us, you need to be a sophisticated citizen in our world in order to build the future. And I think it's imperative that we invest in all of our children from that point of view. My experience as it goes is that there's some brilliant education going on out there. My daughter comes home and does tell me about Shakespeare and puts me to shame. But I think to me, education per se is not the solution to how you grow the economy. It is a solution to how we become a good citizen. I would say to educationists, don't lose your nerve. Because it's just two really quick examples. One is, let's say that we did have a purposive state that took control and released land so that we could build 30 new towns. £30. Imagine what we could do with the innovative bits of the economy if we had that kind of control. Or to go to the other extreme, to go, where I'm from Birkenhead in Merseyside, shipbuilding, Elvis Costello, all of that. The fact of it is that like if you look at the manufacturing bit of the economy, they're doing commercial ship repairs right now. They're working on defence contracts. They're working on offshore wind, and they've got kind of technical skills which are completely unlike the skills that you had 30 years ago. So I would say, in the kind of, the target for the kind of levelling up and all the rest of it, if you're in Birkenhead, don't lose your nerve, because that is the vision for the future that we all need to be involved in and working towards.
Go on, Claire.
Sorry. You were saying what makes it attractive to then want to get involved in having a vocational skills-based training after you leave school. Well, what you have is you have absolutely fantastic further education colleges. You have brilliant apprenticeships. You have a project of building 30 new towns so that there's a load of skills-based jobs that you think, God, I want to be involved in building that town. And then actually part of the discussion about what's going to be in that town in terms of businesses. So people will say, so at the moment, you're right to critique what I'm saying, because at the moment what happens is the only place to go is to university. And we know that university as a mechanism to get a job is disastrous. It's destroyed the ethos of universities. It makes anyone who doesn't go to university feel like second-class citizens. It's not for everyone. I'm simply saying that until 16, and this has got nothing, the culture of failure argument I completely reject, because I taught in further education people who had failed every single possible exam that you could fail, and the hard to teach, and all the expelled. I was that kind of teacher, right? And they were never going to get a great A level in English, right? But they did become lovers of English literature because I basically said, you are entitled to know that this is something that you should do. So it wasn't about jobs. And actually, they loved it. Now, that didn't stop them. They didn't then go, I'm now going to grow up to be an English literature teacher. They just fell in love with poetry. And some of them said, I'm not in love with it, but it wasn't the worst kind of year of my life, going to lessons with you. And that's all I'm saying, right? So I don't think it's an either or. I think that you've got some bits right, but loads of it wrong. But what I'm worried about is to say vocational, academic or equivalent at schools, and at 13 you have to choose that you're the type who'll end up in a vocational course.
That's the tracking system.
Yes, but there's a class aspect of that. We know there's a class aspect of that, and I simply do not believe that working class people are not capable of academic education and going to university, and that even those people who are not academic in a schooling way, who can't fulfil that, doesn't mean to say that they're not the sharpest, brightest people around who don't go on to read, and they might work in the skills. So I just don't want to be in this situation where, are you academic or not? All those people who said, oh, those people who voted leave didn't understand what they were doing, and they hadn't got degrees, and and all the rest of it. And you go and meet them, they were whip smart, read every book in the world, knew everything that you'd never heard of, right? They just weren't academically educated, but they were much better educated and more widely read often. And that's all I'm saying is schools do one thing. It's not going to solve the productivity crisis, and we can make skills a fantastically exciting thing. Do things like your show and building new further education colleges and paying people who work in them a lot more money than they get at the moment.
Well, I'm sure that will be music to their ears, given how many of them are out on the picket lines at the moment. Absolutely brilliant. Well, talking of the audience, I do want to go out one more time before we close this week's episode. So I was working around the room, wasn't I? But just bear with me. Which lady, sorry?
There's that lady over there.
Right, I'm working round that way. So let's start with this gentleman. I'm going to have three, right? So the two of you, sorry, I'll have to go to there. So we'll come.
Do you want me to start then?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
Remember, Gettysburg Address.
Oh, you're going to hold it, are you?
Yeah.
Okay.
So you can take it away if you go on for too long.
Claire, you've been out talking some absolute golden nuggets there, because I believe that the schools, the education system is very, very confused about its objectives. It doesn't know whether it's training or it doesn't know whether it's education. The two are really quite different, because the idea behind education is that you produce a well-rounded person, who's emotionally and all the rest of it. And training is very much an on-the-job thing. Now, I'm going to qualify myself because I'm I'm a retired silicon chip designer, which makes me quite a rare breed, and I've worked at an extremely high level. The first thing I wanted to contribute was I didn't find that there was a culture of passing skills down much. You know, you had to sort of learn and try and pick up this very, very hard subject without very good training from the experienced people above. As I say that, the second thing is that I got fed up with being a gypsy, so I started teacher training. And the system bounced me because I struggled with pitch and pace. But I was very, very disappointed in a number of aspects about the school system that I found it. I mean, first of all, I found that it was terrific grade inflation. And you know, I was teaching from my schooling days, and they thought that I was teaching from a degree level, and I wasn't. This is very, very simple. And I found that there was a kind of a beauty with science, and I couldn't convey it because the system worked against it, because the system was designed. And there's a problem that we have with as an unholy alliance between the education board, the teachers, and the pupils themselves, because the education boards, the exam boards, are incentivized to lower standards, because by attracting more students in, you get more, they get paid by the number of students that they have.
Okay, I need to go on to the next person. I'm really sorry that we're on a schedule here. I'd love to do War and Peace on the exam board. We can talk outside about that. Let's go to the next one, sorry. Yeah. Otherwise it's only going to get lost in the edit, I'm afraid.
Thank you very much. So the question I want to ask relates to the remark that was mentioned at the start. That's really the centre of the discussion. I must say, I'd like to point out that in terms of workers' rights and labour rights, the Tories don't have the best track record. I mean, in the earlier times of the current Tory tenure, we saw the qualifying period for claiming unfair dismissal raised to 2 years from 1, a pretty horrendous assault on the right to claim employment tribunal, the whole tribunal fees fiasco, until it got squashed by the Supreme Court. So the question I want to ask is, are we going to see yet another assault on workers' rights, moving us more towards a situation we see in America where you can be literally let go because your boss got out the wrong side of the bed this morning? Or am I reading too much into a flippant and poorly worded remark?
Okay, well, that's the point, isn't it, about supply side reform and actually what that means in practice. Does it mean a bonfire of labour market regulations? By the way, you know, I think all the main parties at the 2016 referendum said if whether Britain voted to remain or stay, that wouldn't happen. So interesting to see whether it does or not. Right, let's just get one final question in.
Hi, I know we've gone on from there, but right at the beginning of the talk, we were talking about wage stagnation and how actually it is very difficult to be trying your hardest when you know that no matter how much you do, you know, your student loans are going to be, you know, you're only paying off the interest. And there's also, you were talking about how, you know, Claire, sorry, you were talking about how, you know, plenty of people who seem to have totally given up and they don't want to get up at 6 a.m. But then there's the other side where I see a lot of young people kind of going off and doing 80-hour weeks and then burning themselves out and then basically giving up on the whole system. And there's also, I think, when we talk about education, my little brother barely has any GCSEs. He works in a distribution centre, very low wages. And you should see the way he works. He's a blur about the place. He's doing it so quickly, but then he just doesn't believe that he deserves the right to have a comfortable life because he says, "Oh, it's unskilled." And so I was wondering what people would think about maybe the ratio between CEO and lowest paid worker, and how to fix wage stagnation, how to actually get these companies to pay people properly.
Well, that was the Will Hutton argument, wasn't it, in Them and Us a few years ago, the notion of CEOs being paid a maximum multiple 40 times the lowest paid worker, I think it was, that he came up with, which is actually still a lot if you think about it. Premiership footballers on £60,000 a week. Claire, lifelong learning, I mean, that's the response, isn't it, to that woman's brother who feels almost like he's been cut off, he's failed because he hasn't got the GCSEs, and he's back to your point earlier about, are we really valuing these jobs, valuing these vocational skills? Again, it's this sort of default position is low skill, even the language, low skilled and low paid, therefore low value, even if that word then doesn't come out at the end. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, look, you're right to take me up on that, because I think you're absolute. I think there's a cultural problem of people not wanting to tread the boards. As it happens, I think that tends to be actually a more middle class phenomenon, if anything, which is people are like a sense of entitlement, which is, excuse me, I've got a journalism degree, why haven't I got a column? Do you know what I mean? I mean, it's that kind of phenomenon I was more talking about, and kind of, why should I go to work at that early in the morning? Do you know what I mean? I want money. But you're absolutely right to describe something else, and this is what it relates to. I think that many young people, people of many ages, are working their absolute guts out to earn the minimum, and are often doing 3 jobs, and it's bloody hard work out there. And when you say what should you do about it, and it relates to the question was asked there, I mean, I would say join a trade union, fight back. There's a campaign called Enough is Enough who was speaking here. I mean, I'm actually of the opinion that people should get organised and not allow themselves, the lowest in society, to be treated that way. But to your lifelong learning point, my problem is this. The problem with all those low-skilled jobs is not just an attitudinal one where we're kind of mean about low skills. There are low-skilled jobs. And there should be more jobs that are high-skilled jobs, which is why we need to go back a productivity increase. We need to have a new industrial revolution, fantastic jobs that people like your brother can aspire to. And that's where you get your lifelong learning. And then if he's like not sure how to get there, that he's automatically allowed to go on these skills courses, and that he can then get to the jobs. The crisis we've got at the moment is there are a lot of jobs. They're rubbish jobs. They're low paid, don't require a lot of skill, pretty demoralising. People need to do 3 of them, and it's not a very attractive proposition. So I'm trying to revolutionise what work jobs are available for your brother, apart from anything else.
Rosamund, I know you want to come back perhaps on some of the points that were raised by our questioners. Claire talked about rubbish jobs. David Graeber wrote a book a couple of years ago called Bullshit Jobs, and I think we know what we're talking about. Potentially you've seen the multicoloured police cars and all the rest of it. I mean, do we need to sort of look at that as an HR professional looking at job design? Do you think also we've got too many people, frankly, I wouldn't be as disrespectful to say they're non-jobs, right? But, in jobs that arguably they could be in other jobs that are just more productive, add more social value than the ones that they've got.
Yes, I agree. I think one of the things I read recently was that they had introduced a robot to work alongside people in a distribution warehouse at Amazon. They've withdrawn it. So there's things that could be automated that clearly aren't, and release people to do other things, more interesting things. In the IT world that I'm in at the moment, I think what I'd say to your brother is there are companies that will take you in at a low level still and develop you through into something that is, much more worthwhile. So to give an example, somebody joined our company and was trained right through from entry level into cybersecurity. So this person came from a mining family, is now earning, an amazing amount of money that his family could not, conceive of. He wouldn't have conceived of earning. So I think there are still companies out there, I'd want to hold some hope out, that will train and develop people into some new areas. There was a question asked about the bonfire of workers' rights, and is that coming? I mean, I agree with Claire. I think join a trade union. I think trade unions have got some reputational issues, and clearly there's been a reduction over time in trade union membership.
It's about a third of the UK workforce now,
yes,
isn't
that's
it? Compared
right.
to the 1960s, it was 2/3
that's right.
of the workforce. And it is mainly concentrated in the public sector, understandably. They're a large employer. It's not necessarily in the private sector. But also, what is the answer to modern-day trade unionism? Just to push back on you a little bit on this. When you've got 7 million people in the workforce for whom they're their own boss of some kind or another. They're an artist, a peripatetic worker, they're a freelancer, they're a tradesperson. I mean, apart from the Free Speech Union, what union do they join?
Well, I think, yes, there are other unions, I think, that, you can join on that basis. My father was a self-employed musician. He could have joined the musicians' union. So,
that's true. Yeah.
But
Okay.
I don't think there's a bonfire of workers' rights coming. But I think the legislation that has been proposed by the government to limit the union activity and the right to strike is serious. We've got to take it seriously. I mean, they might U-turn on it, but I think that's one of the things they'll probably stick with.
So this goes to the lady who was talking about her brother. I think the way the education system is, and I think your brother may be one of these people, and I was to a certain extent, is that you fall through the cracks in the education system, and you don't get the grades you could have done, or maybe should have done, or maybe that your talents deserved, and then you go into a job where it's a dead end, and it just feels as if you're working simply to exist. But I think what the important thing is never to lose sight that there is always hope, and that there is many people who have been in your brother's situation where they have felt that they're doing this job, they hate it, they're going nowhere, and then for whatever reason, one day they have an epiphany, or one day their chance comes and they can move on from that situation and progress. It's happened to lots and lots and lots of people. I'm sure it will happen to your brother. And I think sometimes going through that phase, as I went through, I did call centre work for NatWest in a debt management section, which was simply the most brutal work I've ever done. Sometimes you need those experiences to actually crystallise what you want in life, what you want to achieve, and what you want to be. And so you can look around and go, the bottom line is, I don't want to effing be here.
Very brilliant.
You're listening to the Skills World Live radio show with Tom Bewick.
And you know what, Francis, again, I know you're a fan of the American dream. I mean, you are a living, breathing example of someone that's worked in an institution. You've worked in these different jobs, as you say. But the saying over the pond is, don't take a job, make a job. And actually what you've done with Constin and others is you've created a whole product, a whole medium, frankly, a job for yourself that's added one job, net job, to the UK economy.
That's not what the left-wing comedians say about what I do. I'm going to be honest with you, they have a very different take on the situation.
Well, that's a whole other podcast. I'm not, look, I'm just the education guide of Skills World Live. I don't have to get into some of that culture war stuff, thank God. But I'm going to come out because obviously Battle of Ideas Festival is all about audience participation, and I feel guilty I haven't been out enough to the audience. So I'm going to come out just for a couple of more questions, so be aware of that. So it could be anywhere in the room. I almost feel like spinning the dial and see where it lands, because there's going to be more people that want to get in that I can physically, within the time limits allowed. Michael, just some quick reflections on what you heard from the audience there.
Yeah, so I mean, I think the first thing to say is that clearly there's a lot of the economy these days is the gig economy. And it's not just in low wage sectors. If you take the film sector in London, you put together a pretty sophisticated team, to come and to do a film shoot, and then 4 days later they're all gone, and that job is over. And you live on your wits, and you live by your network, and you live by your relationships.
Yeah.
So it's not simply a kind of low wage thing. But I just want to say this, right? For a long time, we've kind of, the political class has privileged the idea of enterprise, be enterprising, and spoken to our willingness to do things, and its relationship to the economy is essentially to regulate it. And that I think, allows a situation in which we, collectively, we're not doing anything about the fact that lots of the enterprises are crap. We need to, our intervention cannot just be regulation. It must be to move the dial towards, more productive economy.
You sound like Kwasi Kwarteng. Right. The floor managers waved the yellow card at me, which means there's 5 minutes. We've got to wrap up this podcast, but promise me, if you've got 30 seconds of insight you can deliver for this last closing segment of Skills World Live. I'll be forever in your debt. I'm going to go to someone who hasn't already questioned. So the gentleman at the back.
Yeah, so I'm originally from Liverpool. I came down here.
That's the other side from Birkenhead, isn't it?
It is, technically.
Across the Mersey.
It's one big giant restaurant now. Like. I came here as a job and actor, and I work in an SEMH school as well, so I know the difficulties as well as the lady and yourself are just challenged, as well as Francis. There is no incentive to work in the public service at the moment, and I think a lot of people can say for your own children that you would not want to put your children through it. I've had to cancel my pension only about 3 weeks ago as a result of what's going on through this crisis at the moment, because I'm literally counting my pennies now.
Well, so they don't get you caught on the auto-enrolment over a certain amount where they make you pay in regardless of whether or not you want to.
Exactly.
It's not
so
a bad
it's not
thing.
Really, it's not even nominal.
Okay, I'm going to go to the gentleman next to you, if that's all right, just to get his final
Thank you.
burst in.
Just a final word. I was going to address what Francis said about the fact that the reason people don't want to vote Conservative, especially young people, is because they don't have anything to conserve. But I think the issue is, you can conserve more than property. There are shares out there in the market that cost 20 pence to buy. But the issue isn't people wanting to acquire things and feeling like they don't have the ability to acquire things. It's the education. There's no education in terms of how to invest and how to actually make money and make the best use of your money.
Okay, right, we've got about 3 minutes left, and that's a big topic in its own right, intergenerational asset inequality. But Francis, he's got a point, hasn't he? I mean, we've sold out, frankly, the younger generation. They're not the ones until, arguably, if they've got parents that own these multi-million pound houses, are not going to benefit straight away. I mean, Liam Halligan was talking about this earlier on another podcast. 1989, 20 months was the average amount of time. If you're a working class person saving up for a mortgage, 3 or 4 times multiple of your salary. Today, it would take 20 years to be able to save up to get on the first rung of the housing ladder. I mean, not that housing ownership necessarily is the be-all and end-all, but it does give people a lot of financial security, doesn't it?
It gives people a lot of financial security. It gives people stability. We're quite simply, we don't have enough young people getting married and having children. We have a very low birth rate.
You offering?
But I don't think biologically it would work, Tom. I mean, maybe that's a debate for another.
I don't have a cervix.
Yeah, but the problem is that successive governments have consistently failed to deal with this problem. We are where we are. And the reality is, you can't expect young people to settle down and have children if they don't have any form of stability. And owning property gives you stability. The reality is, in this country, with the rental market the way it is, with renters' rights the way it is, it's a very unstable way of living where 1 year to the next you could be gone from your property. And people, you're not incentivizing people to settle down, have children, and create a life for themselves.
Yeah, well, Liz Truss is saying that she will ban no-fault evictions, and over your renters is something that means a huge amount, particularly if you've got a family. As you say, you can't move every 6 months when you've got your kids settled at school. But we'll see. Hopefully she won't make another U-turn on that particular policy. Claire, as the founder of this brilliant festival, and I'm going to be getting stuck into another session right after this one. That's why I'm determined to finish on time as well, because I want to get along, actually, to his mate, Constance Kissin's book review. But final word to you.
Well, I was going to say that I was really inspired by Mick, you talking about 30 new towns, because I think it's such a shock when you hear somebody talk about 30 new towns, not 30 new houses on the outskirts of a village, that you kind of go, what's he talking about? 30 new towns, 30 new towns. But actually, we need 30 new towns, new cities, that kind of ambition. And I think that that's what's lacking. It is like a kind of low-grade ambition, even the kind of growth. They never make it feel real. And I also thought that it was brilliant to hear your example, Rosie, of a company that would take somebody and allow them those opportunities. So what I want to see is more companies rise into to doing that. They should be training people up. Companies are just, if anyone's lazy, it's not the workers, it's the companies that just go, unless you give me a subsidy, government, we're not doing it. Whereas they should be taking responsibility. But the state should be incentivising to a certain extent, or rather penalising if they don't. Maybe that's the way to do it. But generally, to encourage that kind of thing, and I think that would make a huge difference. And your point about lots of the trade unions are public sector jobs, I'm afraid that says something very weak about British society. I mean, I'm from Wales. All the jobs are public sector. That means that we haven't got a productive economy, and actually, public sector is not making anything. I mean, it does lots of valuable things, right? But it doesn't produce anything. And in order to have a public sector that's funded, you need a productive economic sector that's able to create the wealth, make the cake bigger, that funds it. And I think that you can be on the left, on the right to understand that. And I'm afraid that the left and the right have not understood it for a long, long time. So what I think the only bit we should hold on to from Liz Truss is productive growth, and don't then rely on her to explain how to do it, but listen constantly to Tom's podcast, because he talks about skills and the kind of ways that you can actually make the economy productive enough.
I do indeed, Claire, and thanks for that. But I'm also, with trepidation, not looking forward to the Skills World Live email inbox on Monday from subscribers from Wales who might have a few things to say about those comments. Well, folks, that's all we've got time for on the show this week. Just leaves me to thank our brilliant panel for such a productive and informed way of debating in these challenging issues. Who knows, maybe there'll be a ministerial job or two going for them, particularly given the turnover over at His Majesty's government. And huge thanks to you, our audience, who participated throughout today's proceedings. I'm Tom Bewick. You've been listening to Skills World Live Radio Show at fenews.co.uk. See you again next time.
Remember to subscribe to Skills World Live at fenews.co.uk, or just download the show from any one of your favourite podcasting sites, including iTunes, Spotify and Spreaker. Your world, Skills World.